going to talk about a bunch of stuff. I want to start, though, with one of the most basic questions for any commander-in-chief. Cases where the United States is not directly hit, but where American interests are implicated. What is the Jeb Bush doctrine for when and how you commit American troops on the ground overseas?
I think you have to have a compelling national security interest, and in the case of Islamic terrorism, we have it. This is a unique circumstance, not seen before in history, where you have a caliphate that has been formed whose energy is maintained and strengthened by its existence, and its ability to provoke acts of terror around the world is real. And so I think this is a direct threat to our national security interests.
So you've said you want to declare war against ISIS.
Well, because they're declared war on us.
And yet you've not answered directly when asked about the amount of American ground troops beyond special forces. So if this is a case where we should declare war, if there's a vital American interest at stake, why aren't you for substantial ground troops?
Because I can't give you a number without the Commander-in-Chief. The President of the United States would tell his military advisors, give me options for a strategy to take out ISIS. And I don't know what the answer would be to those options. I can't tell you that. I don't have those skills.
It doesn't necessarily involve substantial ground troops?
It could.
But not necessarily.
Not necessarily. I think that if we could mobilize the support of the neighborhood, which has got to be essential, we can't do this alone, support from Europe, support from Turkey, from Egypt, from Jordan, all of these countries directly impacted by this grave threat, certainly the Persian Gulf countries, we could have an international force led by Americans for sure, and certainly with our air power, where we could destroy ISIS. And I think that's the goal. It isn't to contain. That's a joke. Containing only gives them energy and makes them an even greater threat.
When you talk about declaring war, there are people out there, some members of your party who want right now to invoke Article 5.
Yeah.
Do you want to do that?
I think if France calls for it, there should be a serious conversation about that. I think this requires American leadership, whether it's through NATO or directly. The net result is we need to lead. We need to be the leader of this effort. There should be a clear stated objective, and we should use awesome force, not incremental force, which is what we're doing today.
So when you talk about declaring war, I think there's a broad view that America is a war-weary country after Afghanistan, after Iraq. Do you agree that the country is war-weary?
It is war-weary for sure, and the use of the declaration of war was not a formal, formal statement, but to recognize that Islamic terrorism and the terrorists that head it up are declared war on us, we should take them seriously. Sometimes when people say things, we should actually believe what they say.
So how do you deal with that war weariness? How do you muster the kind of public support that would be necessary for an aggressive action against ISIS? How do you get over that war weariness in America?
I think you have to give people a sense that there's a clear strategy, that we're not doing this incrementally, that we're not going to be stuck in a quagmire, that if we do it, we're doing it with all the resources that we can bring to bear and the international community with us, and that we're quick and decisive, and then we move on. I think the fear of weariness is legitimate, that if we get into extended wars and there's no clear strategy and we get stuck, that the costs are high and Americans lose their life.
Is that the condition that exists in the conflict in Afghanistan now?
There's better stability today. We're moving towards a stable Afghanistan for sure, but it's the longest war in American history.
But are we stuck there?
It's the longest war.
Are Americans right to say, look what's happened in Afghanistan, we're wary of going in other places?
If we can, in the case of Afghanistan, similar to Korea, similar to Japan, provide a force that allows for security to exist, similar to Iraq with 3,500 troops now, that is not necessarily prolonging the war. That's creating a secure country that will allow us not to have to come back in. I think that's appropriate. But the reason, I'm answering honestly your question, it's a good one. The people are weary of war, and so a commander-in-chief, the president, has to create a clear strategy for people to know that this is something that's not going to go on forever. This president, twice in the last year and a half now, has said we don't have a strategy. It's pretty breathtaking if you think about it. We have 3,500 troops in Iraq and no strategy. We have 50 special operators in Syria with no strategy. We have warfighters that are risking their lives over, in their fighting in the air with no strategy.
Let me ask you about refugees. President Obama yesterday said that we should have no religious test for compassion when it comes to the Syrian refugees coming in. And he went on to say that that it was sort of shameful and not American to suggest that there should be a difference. First of all, let me just ask you whether you've said that we should focus on Christian refugees from Syria. Did you take President Obama's comments personally? Did you take that as a direct shot at you?
Well, he didn't mention my name, but yeah, I mean, I've had this view for a long while that religious minorities in the Middle East and around the world are deserving of our support, because but for us who?
Right.
So I believe that we should take a stand to help people. In Mosul, Mass is no longer given, no longer said after 1,400, 1,500 years. The Yazidis are being exterminated. You have enslavement, beheadings. The brutality of Islamic terrorism is such that I think we do have a duty to act.
But you don't disagree with the fact that Muslims are the primary, they're suffering, the vast majority of sufferers, and the refugees are Muslims. So why?
Well, the vast majority of people are Muslims, for sure.
So why discriminate against Syrian refugees?
There's no discrimination to simply say that you want to protect religious minorities that are being exterminated. The solution, as it relates to the innocents in Syria, in Iraq, is to create a strategy to destroy ISIS and to bring about change as it relates to the Assad regime. That's where American leadership needs to be played. If we're just responding to a crisis by our inaction of creating an overflow of refugees, I mean, that's not an answer. That's just once again reacting to events that you didn't help try to deter.
So 26 or 27, I believe now, governors have said no Syrian refugees. They want no Syrian refugees in their states. Senator Cruz has introduced a bill saying no Syrian refugees at all in the United States, Muslim Syrian refugees in the United States. You agree? You support that bill, and how do you feel about those governors?
I haven't seen the bill, and I think people are legitimately concerned about the efficiency, the competency of the Obama administration as it relates to screening processes. But we have systems in place. We should, if there's any kind of concern, we shouldn't allow people in. But I don't think we should eliminate our support for refugees. It's been a noble tradition in our country for many years.
Including Muslim refugees? You don't want to ban Muslim refugees from coming to the United States?
I don't.
Forget about the bill.
The answer to this, though, is not to ban people from coming. The answer is to lead to resolve the problem in Syria. That's the ultimate answer, and that's my focus.
You mentioned air power before. Some are saying now, given that ISIS is not showing respect for human life, to say the least, that the West needs to lower the concern that it's had about casualties, civilian casualties in bombing. How do you grapple with that?
Well, in my briefings about this, there's some frustration by military commanders that the lawyers are on top of every sortie. And I think if we view this as a fight for our time, that this is a threat to Western civilization, then we need to be aggressively pursuing a strategy to take out ISIS, and the warfighters need to have their hands untied. You can balance this, perhaps recognizing, still recognizing that there's a lot of innocent people in these. They're embedded inside of Mosul, for example. Trump's idea of bombing Mosul, I mean, or whatever he's saying, that's just not. You don't do that. You're going to have ground troops. There's going to have to be an international fighting force. In the case of Iraq, it would be the Iraqi military, along with Sunni tribal leaders and the Kurds. And we would be partners in that.
But at this point, would you say civilian casualties, targets will have to be hit, even if they're more risk of civilian casualties than would have been acceptable before?
My position on this hasn't changed. This is war, and we need to treat it as war.
So even if there's civilian casualties, if the
this
Pentagon
is war.
says
this is war.
That's a target,
it's not you don't go out of your way to kill innocents. We have a noble tradition doing that, but I think this administration has not viewed it. They view it as a law enforcement exercise. They have lawyers on top of it. That's not the attitude that you need to be successful.
Just ask you one more time. So civilian casualties are just part of war, and so
of course they are, Mark. I mean, look at history. Has there ever been a time where we don't have? You have to. It's not a video game. This is why it's a serious endeavor to when you're aspiring to be President of the United States, to send men and women in harm's way. It's a serious undertaking, and you have to do it recognizing that we want to win, and do so in a way that allows for a more secure world.
He made a real point of praising your brother yesterday for avoiding saying that we were at war with Islam. People in your brother's administration have said that not only did the administration avoid saying we're not at war with Islam, but they avoided the phrase we're at war with radical Islam. Elliot Abrams has said that, argued for why that was important.
Yeah.
You now say we must say that we're at war with radical Islam. So what's the reason for the difference between your and your brother's postures on this?
We may have a difference, but it's the avoidance of it that seems to be amazing. These Democratic candidates and President Obama get all twisted up like a pretzel to avoid the term Islamic terrorism in the same sentence. And this is an ideology. This is a political ideology. They've co-opted a religion, but they are Muslim extreme terrorists, and they need to be taken out. I think this is a question of semantics, but the simple fact is, to avoid this conversation creates a whole set of policies that is defeatist in its nature.
Let me ask you about one other thing.
No one, by the way, I don't think anybody would have suggested my brother wasn't focused on destroying radical Islam. Whether he didn't use the term or not, I don't think anybody ever thought that. He was a little weak on this.
There was a reason, though, why he avoided using it. Again, a lot of people from his administration made the point that they went out of their way to avoid using that term because they did not want to have this cast as a religious war.
But here, the world changes, and so in 2017, the threat of ISIS is, as it gains strength, the threat of the black flag of ISIS going up in Mecca, in Medina, in Cairo, in other countries. And so I think the rest of the Muslim world now sees this threat in a different way than they might have 15 years ago.
Let me ask you about Donald Trump real quick. He said yesterday that we may need to surveil some mosques in the United States in a more intense way than we do now, and he's open to the idea of even shutting some of those mosques down. How do you feel about that issue?
I have confidence in the FBI doing their job, protecting civil liberties and doing their job. Donald Trump's been all over the map on the question of ISIS. He at one point said, let Russia take ISIS out, and then he said, let ISIS take Assad out. Now he wants to bomb ISIS. He doesn't want to create a strategy and have the United States military lead an effort. It's a pretty good example of why he can't be trusted being President of the United States, in my mind.
You said you trust the FBI. Can you envision any circumstances where you would say, yeah, mosques should be shut down?
No, I can't, unless there is identified threats to the national security of our country. I think we've got to be cautious about the world we're moving towards. This is to protect our freedom, not to take freedom away.
Assad, you mentioned him a couple of times. He seems to be the cause of a lot of instability, not just in the region, but in the world now. Why wouldn't it be appropriate to do what a previous president did with Saddam Hussein and go into Damascus and take him out?
I think it is appropriate. This is what I've been saying. I gave a speech at the Reagan Library saying that you can't deal with ISIS without dealing with Assad. He has killed over 200,000 innocent people in his country. He is supported by radical Shia terrorists. The notion that somehow we're going to trade sides, if you will, in a very complicated way, I think we need to simplify this. There are terrorists, Shia and Sunni, that want to destroy the modern Arab world, and they want to destroy Western civilization. And that focus is where our focus needs to be, is to attack both sides of that.
Right. I know you think he should go, but should the American military remove him?
I think we ought to create a no-fly zone to limit his power. And
that's
I think
not going to get him out of office.
Well, it could if we're serious about building a force trained by the United States, an international fighting force, the third option, if you will. It used to be called the Syrian Free Army.
But you don't
if you recall,
you supported removing Saddam Hussein by force. This is a guy who's used weapons of mass destruction against his own people, who's a threat to Israel, who's a threat to the region.
I think Assad can be removed diplomatically when he has no other options, and that requires American leadership, and that requires a presence that would create a third force between ISIS and Assad.